Welcome to the podcast of Data and Analytics in Business. We'll learn from the leading industry experts using data and analytics to solve the problems and create values in practice. We'll also learn where the industry is heading to and how data and analytics will shape the industry in the future. Most importantly, how they are preparing their business for digital transformation and disruption in the future. I'm your host, Jason Tan, and thank you for listening. In this episode, we have P Fernando. Stephen is the Director of Corporate Service at Mackay Regional Council, a local administration covering 12,000 square kilometres bordering Victoria, Australia. Now, Stephen shared with me how he started his career in local government agency, especially in regional Australia. This includes 10 years of experience working as a CFO at Mackay Council in central Queensland. Naturally, I wanted to understand the role of analytics, and I asked Stephen about the smart city works that he and his team implemented in Mackay. He shared with me a real use case study where they wanted to achieve an objective to get people to use less water while also keeping council water rates affordable for the people in Mackay. As part of this project, it involved the use of marketing campaigns, social media, full-scale smart metering projects that are aided by the use of data and analytics. It is really an eye-opening learning experience for me on how analytics is used to manage public infrastructure. As I delve further into the details, I asked Stephen for his perspective on the project and the use of analytics, but more from the lens of a CFO. This is where he shared with me how to bring the strategy, capital decisioning making, improve efficiency, and find new opportunities using data analytics in his role as a CFO in a local government agency. And finally, I asked Stephen to share with me about his view of risk management by the government agency. This includes the strategy on technology adoption, managing project and investment. Now, if you are always interested in how to use data analytics to efficiently manage public infrastructure like water service, I highly recommend you to tune in and listen to Stephen. If you are a senior executive in private sector and want to understand how the corporate service within the government agency work with data and analytics, this is the episode you do not want to miss out. If you have any question for Stephen or myself, make sure you send us an email or message Stephen on LinkedIn. And you can find the link in profile of Stephen on the write-up. This episode is sponsored by the new program at DDA. It is an analytic leader mentorship program for senior manager and executive in the business team who want to develop a data-driven business to drive customer experience excellence. For a small one-off annual fee, you get to book unlimited strategy session for a full year. For more information about this program, please reach out to me. Last but not least, make sure you click the subscribe button before the interview starts, so you will be the first to be informed on the latest episode on how business leaders run a high-performance organization using data analytics. I am your host, Jason Tan, and thank you so much for listening. Hello, Stephen. Welcome to the Analytics Show podcast. Super excited to have you here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
The pleasure is mine. I wanted to ask you about the works and your writing on Medium and read a little bit about that, especially the article titled Perspective, where you wrote about looking at the new, at the time, the pandemic from a more positive angle. So I suppose at a time where so much uncertainty and doubt, what pushed you to write such an inspiring piece, and what must have been your own worries?
I guess I was trying to make my own little contribution to helping all of us deal with a situation we had really never faced before. We had no reference points, and that makes making sense of things very difficult. Today, especially in places with economic prosperity, we are not as good as dealing with adversity, say like our grandparents were. We like to think we now control almost everything. The fact is, we never will. To succeed in the post-pandemic world, we will need the skills necessary to thrive through various kinds of adversity. And we see examples of that through this crisis. Whether those adversities are about health, natural disasters, economic downturns, or something else. So I guess that was my little contribution to optimism and a positive outlook.
Thanks, Steve, for sharing that. I think optimism is certainly so important for us to push ahead in business and in life. Now, that being said, I feel like the pandemic has progressed over the last year. And while the pandemic subsides in some parts of the world, it also seems to grow greater in other parts. Do you have a message to the business leaders who are still struggling to get back on their feet?
Yes, definitely. I know a lot of people who are doing it really tough, especially in places that do not have the same economic resilience that we say in Australia as a country may have. I think the most important element for getting through diversity is support. We need to generate that sense of community we seem to be losing and support each other in any way we can, whether it's family, the neighborhood, our colleagues, or even the wider community. I saw in the news recently a Sikh community in Sydney that has been distributing meals, some incredible number, throughout this pandemic from the start to anyone who needed it. Supporting each other, knowing what others are going through, and sharing our troubles with others. All of these enables us to build an incredible level of resilience. Your question was about business leaders. And as business people and professionals, we can definitely build support networks and help each other. Something small I try to do is to help young companies, especially with less experienced founders, to navigate these difficult times.
That's great. I'm curious to know within the context of Australia and where you are at of the regional part of Australia, where you spend a lot of your time in terms of your career and living, do you find it is equally challenging for the regional Australia as compared to the metro?
I think, yeah, the challenges and the hurdles may be different, but they are definitely equally challenging, especially regions that rely a lot on tourism from the bigger metropolitan centers and even international tourism. They have just disappeared, and that is causing a lot of knock-on effects. There are people who are having to sell off property just to keep their businesses alive.
I'm hopefully that we are seeing the light of the tunnel and the border will be opened up soon. So finger crossed. Now, moving on, please share with us a bit about your role heading up the business and corporate service function within the local government. And tell us more a bit about the Mackay Regional Council and the Riverina area for our listener who may not be familiar with the region.
I migrated to Australia in 2007. And pretty much since then, I have been in local government. It is a great sector to work in if you are looking for purpose in the work you do. Sometimes you can feel like the community you are working for does not appreciate the work that is being done. But it is a sector where things you do has a fairly direct impact and a fairly immediate impact on people's lives. I have been blessed with the opportunity to work in a great region of Australia for over 10 years. That is the Mackay Whitsunday area in central Queensland. For those not very familiar, that is on the eastern coast of the country towards the north. It is where the Great Barrier Reef starts and stretches further north. I like to describe it as an area where the modern conveniences of urban living is combined with the relaxed charm of country life. The longest drive I have had to work has been just 20 minutes.
Oh, that's nice.
Very recently, I moved out of that area into a very different but equally great area. which is the Riverina region of New South Wales, on the banks of that famous Mackay River. The area straddles both New South Wales and Victoria, with the river as the boundary between the two states. And unlike the Mackay Whitsunday areas, this is very much inland. At its core, it's a farming area with grain, vineyards, and of course, that means wineries, and animal husbandry, mostly sheep. And here, despite living in a house from which I cannot see any neighboring houses, which means that my property is quite large, my drive to work now is less than 10 minutes. This is also one of the fastest growing areas in New South Wales, mostly because of its relative proximity to Melbourne, which is about 2 to 3 hours driving time. In this new post-pandemic or still pandemic era, if you can predominantly work from home, but need to get occasion to your workplace in or around Melbourne, this is a great place to pitch your tent.
Nice. I can relate that some of the listeners who live in the big metro who have to commute 2 or 3 hours every single day just to get to work, I think that is something that many of them would be jealous of. I suspect that post-pandemic, many of us is probably going to move into more of a hybrid solution where a couple of days at home, a couple of days at the office. Do you think that is going to be the case for you guys at the Murray River, despite that the close proximity to the office?
A lot of us work from home these days. It's sort of forced on us, but we really haven't had too many issues as a result once we got the basic infrastructure going initially. And that was even the case with Whitsundays. So I would say it's here to stay more and more. Part of the time, at least, people will work from home, what we call the hybrid solution, I guess.
I think so, especially that people have a taste of that, who have never had a taste of that, but now they do. I think they would very much would want to have that sort of flexibility.
Definitely. And it's a great area to bring up young families. That's a good thing about Australia. Even in regional areas, we have good facilities like schools and medical facilities and so forth. So if you can do your work from home, it's a great place to live in.
I agree. Now, speaking of Mackay and Whitsunday, you and the project that you did at Mackay was recently featured in the Financial Management magazine, published by the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants of the UK. Now, can you please explain what smart city have to do with analytics, given of what you wrote in this magazine and publication?
Well, I'll start by being a bit cryptic and saying everything and nothing.
What do you mean by that? I'd like to hear more, please.
When we usually hear the term smart cities, the tendency is to think about technology. While technology is a key enabler in that process, it is really not about technology. First and foremost, it's about people. It's about making cities more livable, which can include things like sustainability, prosperity, efficiency, vibrancy, and resilience. It is about delivering outcomes that make the place a better place to live in. Now, where technology comes in is to help capture data about what is happening in the area that you are trying to manage and trying to improve. While we have heard of things like data is the new gold, data by itself is not very useful. What is useful is when data is used to generate insights into what is happening. And that is where analytics comes in. The most important element in analytics is to clearly understand, at least at a broad level, what you are trying to achieve, what outcomes you like to see. That process at a very basic level is not new. We have been doing that for well over a century. What is new is our ability to capture vast amounts of data, we call it big data, from places and in ways we couldn't do before. And now we can do that in a very economical manner. And the significant advances we have made in analytical capabilities is also new. Now, I use the word cities several times in this response because the question was about smart cities. But that is a bit of a misnomer because the concept is equally applicable to rural or regional areas, say managing vast stretches of farmland. It is also equally applicable to business entities, whether big or small. So coming back to the question, what does smart cities have to do with analytics? Like I said, smart cities is about improving people's lives. Technology helps us capture data and transport it. And analytics helps us to make sense of that data to improve our decision making. That's the link.
I want to talk about, you mentioned that the data is the new gold. I recently heard of a joke that it was saying that data is the new oil and data leakage must be the new oil spill on the ocean. I can't help
Yes,
it.
I've heard of data is the new oil also because it makes the economy go around.
and the data leakage is a new oil spill. So that was so classic. That was just a nice one that I want to share with you. I want to continue on what you were just describing, that especially I find that from what I learned is some of the business leader in particular, maybe in the regional area, perhaps find themselves intimidated by the idea of starting an analytic journey, or especially for a smaller company. Seeing you have had experience doing just that, what is your advice in terms of the best way to set up and start an analytic journey?
I think I mentioned briefly in my previous response that the cornerstone in any analytics process is having a good sense of the end game, the outcomes you are trying to achieve. Analytics is a tool, not an end in itself. So without knowing what you are trying to build, how do you figure out what tools you need and how to use them? Therefore, first, we need to work on our strategy, the business strategy. Then you need to figure out what insights would be useful in order to implement that strategy. With that, you can start to get an understanding of what sort of data would be needed to get at those insights and what technologies will help you capture that data cost effectively. So it's a bit of a linked up process. I'll take an example of a project that I was involved in. There, what we were trying to achieve was to get people to use less water. That was our end goal. We then started putting together a strategy to get at that, which involved things like a social marketing campaign. We realized that if we understood how people used water in detail, like how, when, where, why, etc., we could tailor our messaging much better in that social media campaign and also provide good information and tools to the customer for them to be more water wise. That is what led us to do a full-scale smart metering project in the Mackay region. Technology and analytics played a big part, but it was ultimately about improving sustainability and affordability of an essential service. Once you start generating data, you will most definitely find a range of users that you can put it to, not just the initial use that you thought of. For example, the smart meter data we generated also provided us with insight into how our network was performing. So in addition to customer insights, we were getting operational insights as well. Like most things, I would advise start small with small financial commitments. Experiment and figure out what works, and then build from there. Don't be afraid of going back to the drawing board if you have to. In the example I gave before, The first trial we did was just for 7 meters. The first analytics was on a basic spreadsheet. And the first outcome we achieved, I can still remember that, was getting and fixing a leak in a toilet block in a park. That was a first small step in a journey with very significant impacts.
I love you use the spreadsheet to do the proof of concept. And I often say, there's nothing wrong with the spreadsheet. It still works as long as it gives us the result. I have heard about that presentation and read about that digital metering for the water service before. It was quite a success. Can you share with us in terms of the success result towards the end or after years of implementation?
Yes, it's a circularity that can build in itself. As I mentioned, you start with a broad strategy and outcome in mind. But as you go along, as you get better insights through your analytics, you then have a basis to refine your strategy. You have the data, you have the insights. You can figure out what more analytics you may want to do and what additional data you may need to do those analytics. I'll just take a different example, a basic retail enterprise that has, let's say, both brick and mortar and online channels. Now, your sales data will tell you how much is being done by each channel. But would it not be good to understand how one channel influences the other, whether there are interdependencies or not? Some basic data capture and analytics could give you insights into that. And that knowledge then can help you with your strategy and help in deciding what investments you want to make where. So that's how it can link back to strategic decision making.
I love that. And I want to provide a bit context to some of the listener is that your role at the Mackay region was a CFO for the city council. And that is why for you is always about how to use the analytic and also how to link all of this journey back to the strategic and capital decision making from the finance perspective. So that was a great insight. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, my next question for you is, returns come from when you find insights in analytics. But I suppose the question I have for you is, how do you confidently apply this insight to improve efficiency and find new opportunities?
Yes, that is the crux, really, where your investments will generate a return. And that is where entrepreneurship or professionalism comes in, where creativity and human ingenuity will play a big role. In some instances, it's driven by the ingenuity of a single person. If you look at globally, you can think of somebody like Steve Jobs, a single genius. But in a lot of other places, the catalyst is the way a team works together, the culture of the place. Things like the type of people you hire, the investments you make in building skills and improving culture, all of that contributes to assist you in making better use of the insights that you get. In this phase, technology has only a limited role. Of course, technology will once again play a big role when you try to implement the initiatives or the new ways of doing things that you have come up with. So the cycle starts again.
I so agree with that. And I suppose in this digital age, I think business leader or executive often get equally so hung up on whether they are using the latest tech or not. But like you say, technology is a technology and technology is advancing faster than ever. Share with us your experience and approach when it comes to adoption of technologies and vendor.
Yes, I think first, make sure you keep yourself informed. Now, that does not mean being an expert in every technology that you may need, but having a decent idea of what is happening, where things are going. you will definitely need to use experts to design and build things you want to do. But in order to make those strategic decisions, you need to know what is happening. Today, there are multiple sources of free information you can use to do that. My issue really is finding the time to go through all of the material, trying to figure out what to focus on and what to prioritize. As you mentioned, technology is changing fast. But the good news is that you don't necessarily have to dump all of your investments in the previous technology to get on board with new technologies. Most of the time, we have advanced knowledge of likely trends. For example, we know electric cars and even self-driving cars are coming. And we can transition with those changing technologies. What it does mean is that we have to continuously invest in and renew our technology assets, both tangible and intangible. It's not any different to any other asset. In addition to operating an asset, you have to maintain it, and you have to have a program for renewing and upgrading it, and eventually you will have to replace it. Technology assets are the same.
So what are the sources do you use to keep yourself informed?
I use a variety of sources based on my interest. For general business knowledge, I use the McKinsey Daily Read from McKinsey & Company, the consulting company. There is quite a bit of technology in it, but it covers a lot of other subjects, and it's very forward-looking. I also get material from the Harvard Business Review, where you can get a limited quantity every month, free of charge. For hardcore technology news, I use the MIT Technology Review and online magazine called Interesting Engineering. Like I mentioned before, I'm also interested in startups. So I also subscribe to the CB Insights newsletter. Quite a bit of tech, as most startups are tech-oriented these days. It's an awesome information on startups. Then for financial and economic news, I generally refer to the Deal book by a guy named Andrew Sorkin, which has quite a strong US financial markets focus. And finally, for personal development matters, I like to read The Friday Forward by Robert Glacier, who also has a podcast called Elevate. Really good stuff. These are all free material, and you can get it delivered into your email as regularly as you want to. As you alluded to at the start, I also have a paid subscription to Medium, which is an online publication covering a variety of subjects. In addition to being a reader, I have done a bit of writing there as well, more as a hobby, not as a profession.
Nice one. I do read quite a few of them. Now, coming back to your corporate experience where you have been working at the local government, I want to ask you the question about the government sector in general, who are very averse to risk. My question for you is, how do you not only establish a better framework in a long-existing organization like this, but also convince the leaders to make the change in the first place, especially with the emerging tech?
Yes, and I think you need to get a bit of understanding of that issue. One thing we have all heard is that experimentation and failure is a fundamental part of any innovation and growth process. We all know that. Unfortunately, with increased transparency of public institutions, even basic failures that is essential for growth can become headline news and public relations nightmares. We have got to the point where we as the public have become intolerant of any failure in our public institutions and are demanding perfection at all times. That is an unrealistic expectation, and that is driving people like elected officials and public servants into behaviors that are not in the interest of the long-term success of the organizations. Like you said, it makes public servants extremely risk averse. And we know unless we are willing to take some risks, there is no reward or growth. However, despite that, quite a few public organizations are doing some great work in the adoption of technologies and driving improved outcomes, initially for their customers, but also for the public in general. I guess the only thing I can offer as a framework to address that is to have in place a very good communication process within public sector institutions. For example, when presenting proposals and requesting for project funds as a public servant, be very clear in the objectives. Don't be overambitious. And very importantly, clearly articulate all the risks so that people who are making decisions about allocating funds know what they're getting into. And if and when things do not go to plan, be quick to communicate that as well. Finally, what I mentioned earlier is something that can help here too. Make small bets. Work your way through as you make progress, and that helps to keep mistakes or failures small as well.
Now, speaking of framework, I'm curious and interested to hear your thoughts on Agile framework and methodology. It is one of the methodology that is currently worshipped everywhere. Given of your experience, how well do you think it is implemented at various government agency and finance department?
I like to define Agile as an approach you take when you have very little clue about what you're doing. That may sound terrible, but that is the case in any new project you undertake. Agile is a new term, but we have been using that approach, maybe not in a structured manner that we have documented now. We have been using that approach for a long time. The issue with government agencies is that we have an annual budgeting process, and thereafter, while it's not impossible, it is a bit more difficult to make changes. With an agile approach, you have to make changes on a regular basis. That's the core concept of agile. As you work things out based on your successes and failures. Therefore, agile and government budgeting don't work well together. The remedy is again what I mentioned in my previous response. Communicate well at the onset so that when you do have to go and ask for changes, you have a reference point to base your requests on.
What about from the finance perspective? What changes do you think are required to make the government agency more agile?
First, we have to be willing to let government agencies take a bit more risk. And that does mean tolerating failures. I'm not sure how you are going to get that outcome because it is a very broad political process and a community process. One thing I believe government agencies can do is to take the spin out of their communications and focus on facts, especially at the inception of projects. This is, of course, easier said than done with politicians. But creating unrealistic expectations for a short-term boost is just not worth the risk on the project as a whole. I also see changes being made in regulatory frameworks to enable flexibility. In the water example, for example, regulations used to be very, very prescriptive of what had to be done. That is changing quite a bit to define these desired outcomes, which then provides the operating agencies the flexibility to come up with different approaches to achieve those outcomes. Another example is in local government. While we have an annual budget and cannot change our revenue models during the year, and that is to provide certainty to our ratepayers, we do have quarterly budget reviews that enable us to make limited adjustments as we go along. So there is scope for that.
Final question before we conclude the interview with my last two questions. Now, for government agency that are still worried about the investment in new technology, what are your tips for them to overcoming this fear?
Well, whether it is a government agency or a private entity, the risks are the same. As we discussed a little bit earlier, the key difference is that in the private sector, there is a higher propensity to take risks. We discussed how we can potentially address that situation in the public sector. Good information, arming yourself with knowledge, communicating the objectives and risks up and down the organization, and taking a step or an agile approach with small financial commitments all help to overcome that fear. That is the same irrespective of the type of organization. It is a good approach to take even for private companies.
I think that is a true agile in practice. I love it. Now, final two questions. Number one, what is your most important first principle?
I would say be true to yourself. Know what your principles are and be true to them. Sometimes that does entail some personal risk, but in the longer term, that is what will enable you to be comfortable with who you are as a person.
What is one book that you have read and thought it would have been better for your younger self to have?
Well, I'll give you two, and they are very different types of books from very different eras. The first is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, who is a Brazilian author. It's a great book about life, resilience, discovering oneself, and appreciating what you have. It has sold over 150 million copies in multiple languages. The second is a very business-oriented book, but about organizational dynamics and culture. It's The Fearless Organization by Professor Amy Edmondson of Harvard University. It is about the concept of psychological safety. Sometimes there is a misconception that psychological safety is about mental health and well-being. It's not that at all.
I agree. I think psychology safety is so important, especially for those who are at the forefront of innovating and trying out new things. You got to make sure that they feel safe to try out and not punish them because they fail in trying out new things.
Yes, but it works equally well. It is needed equally well. And in organizations that are in normal operational mode, not necessarily in the forefront of innovation.
That is true. That is true. Thank you so much, Stephen, for sharing those perspectives and also your view in using the analytic from the finance perspective in the Regional Government Council. I really enjoyed that interview and thank you so much. Again.
Thank you very much, Jason. I have loved being on the show and thank you for having me.